be crazy, loud, overwhelming, and often painful. Our church, this group, wants you to know that we are glad that you are here, right now. This is what we've all been waiting for. Get ready, because we start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey guys, welcome to our YouTube channel. I'm so glad that you're tuning in. You know, I just got to tell you, I can't wait till we can get back together and be face to face with each other, worshiping and learning about God. But for now, we're going to continue on for this season on this YouTube channel. But I know that soon, I hope very soon, and we'll let you know as soon as we can, get back together. You know, we've been in this new series we've called The Savage Life, and we've been looking at the book of Ephesians. And hopefully you've been on the Ephesians challenge, where we're challenging you to read a chapter of the book of Ephesians every day as we work through this series. And as you read through the 6 chapters, start over and begin reading again, because we really want you to get this in your spirit and in your hearts. And
I accept the Ephesians challenge and I'm living a savage life.
I've accepted the Ephesians challenge and I'm going to live a savage life.
Hey guys, I accept the Ephesians challenge because I want to live a savage life.
Hey guys, Mr. Sean here. Want to let you know that I accept the Ephesians challenge and I will live a savage life. Now, the question is, who all is with me? Love you guys.
last week, we formulated 2 categories, 2 different lives a person can live out spiritually: the normal life and the savage life. The normal life is the life made up of living for the next adrenaline rush. And living for that next rush can look differently in your school life, your relational life, your family life, sports, hobbies, friends. But to live for the next adrenaline rush is pretty addicting and totally normal. But the savage life is a life that can be lived for something far greater. It's a life, living your life that a few have the guts to live. Last week we presented the challenge of, rather than living our lives for the next adrenaline rush, we can live our lives by a greater power that is characterized by hope, value, and power in our lives. So there's the normal life and the savage life. And I hope that you choose the savage life. You know, that being said, claiming to live by a greater power is actually not that savage. In a global survey done by a few years ago by the Washington Times, they discovered over 84% of the people in the world identify with a religious group. If you break down that percentage, that's more than 8 out of every 10 people in the world claiming to identify with a religious group. Statistically, many people have the guts to live their religion, but spiritually, few people have the guts to live by grace. You know, banking on grace is savage. There's a verse in the Bible I want us to look at today. It's one of those verses that if it were the only verse you ever heard, it would be enough to grasp the overall message of Jesus. It says this: "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." In the normal life, you can bank on what you earn. In the savage life, you bank on what you haven't earned. Let's break this verse down, but rather than break the verse down by word, let's break this verse down in order of logical thought it's presented. You have been saved. You know, that statement, "you have been saved," communicates an extreme level of confidence and an extreme level of certainty. That's not typical feeling we have when it comes to our relationship with God. In fact, I think our lack of confidence and certainty is the reason we spend so much time thinking about everything else except for God. We rather spend our time focusing on the things we're certain about. For example, on Saturday mornings, you know that when you wake up at 12:30 or some of you 2:30, you're going to have waffles. You're certain about that, or you're certain you're going to go shopping or have a game to play or watch some Netflix. As a result, you spend the majority of your time thinking about the things because they're in your mind, they're certain to happen. However, your relationship with God wasn't meant to be uncertain. Your relationship with God is meant to be the most certain thing you have on this planet. And there's a whole entire book in the Bible written, 1 John, so that people know they are saved. So why do so many of us have uncertainty in our relationships with God? Well, obviously, there's a you in the verse. You have been saved, implying there are you who haven't yet been saved. Some of us have uncertainties in our relationship with God because our relationship with God hasn't been restored, or God seems so distant from us because we just stopped believing in his reality. Or maybe we've never been taught about the reality of God growing up. Whatever the reason, there are some of us who have yet to begin our walk with God. However, there are still plenty of us who have been trying to follow Jesus for quite some time, but still experience high levels of uncertainty in our relationship with God. But the problem isn't merely whether we have confidence in our relationship with God or not. The problem is where we get our confidence from. The next phrase in this verse serves as the foundation of our confidence in our relationship with God. By grace through faith. By grace through faith. People who can have an absolute certainty in their relationship with God are the people who live by grace through faith. You know, we hear the word of grace a lot in the church, but what does grace mean? Grace is God being good to us even though we have given him every reason not to be. Grace is God saying, I love you, I forgive you, I'll start walking with you right now. No strings attached. Grace isn't a formula. Grace is more than a concept or a virtue. Instead, grace is the personified in the person of Jesus. You know, in John chapter 8, there's a woman who's caught in the act of adultery. She's kind of the gal that people at school would label with derogatory names, or someone who was viewed as a total outcast. What this woman was doing was clearly a violation of the religious and accepted law at the time, not to mention within a culture where a woman had zero rights, and that some still exist today. But because this woman's adulterous ways, a bunch of people drag her into the street to kill her by throwing rocks at her, and this was viewed as the punishment for adultery in that time. And as this hostile group brings the woman toward Jesus, he offers an alternative to the folks holding the rocks in their hands. He kind of goes, hey guys, how about this? How about those of you who have never sinned be the one to throw the first stone? When Jesus says this, you can imagine each person holding a rock or boulder, feeling the weight of their own sin in their hands. And one by one, the people dropped the rocks and walked away. I imagine Jesus then bending down to the woman as she braces for her punishment and lightly rubbing his hand over her head. And he says, hey, I love you. I forgive you. Now go and sin no more. Grace is God being good to us even though we give him every reason not to be. So what are your reasons, your regrets, your guilt that stand in the way of you experiencing God's grace? What are the reasons why you think God is irritated, frustrated, or disappointed in you? Instead, Jesus looks at you and says, hey, I love you, I forgive you, now go and let my grace change you. It is believing in the grace of God that changes us. Grace is the fuel to living a life that honors God. Confidence in our relationship with God comes by banking on grace. That's savage. But how do we go about banking on grace? We bank on grace through faith. That's the key. We bank on grace through faith. It's grace. If grace is God being good enough to us, even though he has every reason not to be, then faith is believing God is good enough. So every reason he has not to, right? I know that can sound kind of confusing, but really faith is believing God is good to us even though we give him every reason not to be. As Jesus hung on the cross near his death, there were a couple of criminals who were hanging next to him and mocking him. And one of the criminals says to Jesus, hey, Jesus, remember me when you enter your kingdom that you've been telling everybody about. And Jesus responds, I'll remember you. In fact, today you will be with me in paradise. Think about it. This criminal didn't really know a darn thing about Jesus. Yet as little as this criminal knew, he believed. Jesus didn't just say to the guy, well, in order you to be saved, I'm going to need you to get off this cross, go clean your life up, or go put in a good few Sundays at church, or make a few posts on social media using #Jesus. This criminal just had enough faith to believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and that was enough. Some of us feel like we're a long ways off from having this whole Jesus thing figured out. Some of you, you come to church or you're even listening tonight to this YouTube channel for the first time and you haven't thought about God for a long time. Because whenever you do, you're reminded of the gap that stands between you and Him. Whatever reasons you have for believing God is out to get you, or believing you have burned your bridge with Him, or that He's extremely disappointed in you or mad at you, remember, grace is God being good to us even though we give Him every reason not to be. The question is, do you have the faith to believe in God's grace? Having faith to bank on God's grace is savage. So what gets in the way of our relationship with God being the center on by grace through faith? Banking on God's grace is savage because it demands that we let go of all our pride. You know, Ephesians 2 says, "And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." There are two primary ways where pride can rear its ugly head when it comes to our response to God's grace. One is, I don't need God's grace. And two is, I'm too bad for God's grace. The first one, I don't need God's grace. We all need God's grace. None of us will experience confidence in our relationship with God until we bank on His grace. As long as our confidence in God is tied to what we do for God, we will continue to be bombarded by all the things we need to get better at. There's always some things that can be better. There's always reasons for us to lack confidence in our relationship with God. But that's why we need God's grace. God's grace is God being good to us, even though we give Him every reason not to be. Thank God His grace towards us is not dependent on us, giving Him enough good reasons for Him to be good to us. The second one is, I'm too bad for God's grace. While that sounds somewhat humble, it's actually just the opposite. In the stories we looked at today, the adulterous woman wasn't too bad for God's grace. The criminal who barely knew anything about Jesus, and not to mention he was a criminal, wasn't too bad for Jesus. You can never be too bad for God's grace. You know, God's grace, I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, I can think of so many different things in my own life, in my personal life, that I could illustrate that would show God's grace. Here's a story I want to share with you. I remember as a kid digging a large hole in the backyard with one of my neighborhood buddies. And one afternoon, my buddy's mom came outside and asked, "Why in the world are you guys digging a hole in the backyard?" And we responded enthusiastically, "We're digging a hole to China." You know, no matter how big your hole of sin is when it comes to your relationship with God, you have as much chance of outdigging God's grace as we had digging a hole to China. Today, God looks at you and says, "I love you, I forgive you, and I want my grace to change you." Grace is God being good to us even though we give Him every reason not to be. Do you have faith to believe this? Having faith to bank on God's grace is savage. You know, so many of us look at things and sometimes people think, well, man, I could take advantage of God's grace. You know, if God doesn't punish me for the things that I do, why should I stop doing them? And that's a good question. And it speaks about that even in Romans, where he says, do I just continue to sin and eat up this extraordinary grace of God? You know, and this is the picture I'd like to give you. Think of somebody that you really, really love. Somebody that's really important to you. You really care about that. And I want you to picture that person standing next to you, and that every time you do something wrong or you sin against God, somebody takes a strap and hits that person you love, punches that person you love, strikes a nail into that person you love, every time. And you're seeing this, and you're viewing this, and you're watching this. And at first you may just be shocked by it, but then you come again to another opportunity to sin, and maybe you do it again, and again those same things happen to that person that you love, that you see and is certain in your life. You see, we would probably stop doing it because, number one, out of the love, plus we recognize, we know this person, that person is a certainty in our life. But how many know each time that you and I sin or do something to displease God, Jesus is again taking the stripes, taking the punishment for you, so that you and I, that's the grace, that you and I don't get what we deserve. Don't you think we'd stop it? But I think it comes back to that. Is Jesus a real certainty in your life? Is he really that real to you? Just like that person you love, that would hurt you and take you and cause you to walk away. That's what grace should do. Grace should say, I received something I didn't deserve, and I'm not getting what I do deserve. And because of that great love of what Jesus did to me, I stop walking in the sin that I once walked in. I walk away and I walk in this grace. You know, and sometimes I think we got to see grace in another way. I think grace is also there to try things that are good that we may fail at. Sometimes we don't do things for Jesus, or God's calling us to something and we think, what if I fail? What if I don't succeed at this? Well, I'm telling you, that same grace that covers our sin is that same grace that'll cover your mistakes, even on doing some good things or doing things you thought God wanted you to do. Sometimes we got to step out and not worry about whether it's gonna be a mistake or something big. If God's calling, just try it. His grace is going to cover the areas that you and I are weak in. His grace is going to cover the areas that you and I make mistakes. In fact, I pray His grace covered this whole sermon for the multiple mistakes that I probably make speaking or saying or pronouncing a word wrong. God's grace covers that. And God's grace takes it to the next level, which makes it savage. So guys, I pray that you would walk in a grace life, that you would walk in a life that is so full of certainty of who Jesus is, so full of the certainty of God's grace. By the faith that He gives you, this free gift. God just wants you. Believe in Him. Walk in faith and grace. And don't worry, it'll take time. You may not get it right at the beginning, but God will keep covering you. He'll keep telling you, I love you, I forgive you. Stand with your head up and keep walking forward. Because we want to live a savage life, that we're banking on the grace of God to try new things for Jesus, to try things beyond what we think our own capabilities are, to see the miraculous happen in our lives. Bank on the grace of God. God bless you. Make sure you get into your Zoom groups at 7:30 after this service. We will see you there. But I hope you have a great rest of your week. Continue on with the Ephesians Challenge and know that God's grace is covering your life. We love you. We can't wait to see you again. God bless.